Welcome to today's lesson, which is about multiplying integers. The goal of today's lesson is that you can multiply positive and negative integers. Let's look at multiplication on the number line. So let's start with 3 times 2. So we'll start at 0 here and we'll add 3 2's. So the first 2, the second 2, the third 2, and we can see on the number line that 3 times 2 equals 6. Now let's look at 3 times negative 2. Again, let's start at 0 and negative 2, negative 4, negative 6. So let's look at patterns for these multiplication problems. So we had 3 times 2 is 6, which was positive, and 3 times negative 2 was negative 6, which was negative. Let's look at 2 times 5. So we've got 5 plus 5 is 10, and it's positive. And if we were to look at 2 times negative 5, we'd go in the opposite direction and get negative 10, which is negative. And let's look at one more example. 3 times 3, all positive. We get 9, positive, and 3 times negative 3, we'd go in the opposite direction and get negative 9, which is negative. So to notice a pattern here, we can see that every time we multiply two positive numbers, the sign of the product is positive. So the sign of the product of two positive numbers is positive. And let's look at what happens when we multiply a positive number by a negative number. So here we've got a positive number by a negative number. Our sign is negative. A positive number by a negative number, sign is negative. And same here. So the sign of the product of a positive integer and a negative integer is negative. Now let's look at multiplication as addition of the opposite. So let's start with negative 3 times 2. And before we do that, let's do 3 times 2. 3 times 2. So we have 2. And negative 3 times 2 is the opposite of that. So the opposite of 6 is negative 6. The opposite, go all the way over to here, is negative 6. And let's look at negative 3 times negative 2. Let's start off by looking at 3 times negative 2, which we saw in a previous slide. We had negative 6. And when we have negative 3 first, here, we need to find the opposite of that. So let's find the opposite of negative 6, which is 6. So let's look at a pattern in the signs of the answers now, the signs of the products. So when we had negative 3 times 2, we were multiplying a negative number by a positive number. Our sign was negative. When we are multiplying a negative number by a negative number, like negative 3 times negative 2, our sign, as you saw on the previous slide, was positive. So we have negative 3 times negative 2, the sign was positive. Let's look at negative 2 times negative 5. First, let's do 2 times negative 5, and we saw that that's negative 10 on a previous slide. And now to get negative 2 times negative 5, we want the opposite, because negative here is the opposite of positive, the opposite of negative 10, which is 10. Oops, I overshot it there. So we get to 10, which is positive. So we multiplied two negative numbers here, we got a positive sign. And Finally, let's look at negative 3 times negative 3. We saw on a previous slide that 3 times negative 3 is negative 9, and we have negative 3 times negative 3, so we want the opposite of this, which is 9. So when you multiply two negative numbers together, as we see on the table here, the product will always be positive. So to summarize, you're multiplying two numbers. First, multiply them without the signs, and then ask yourself, do they have the same sign? Ask yourself here. If they have the same sign, whether they're both positive or both negative, the product is positive. If they do not have the same sign, one is positive and one is negative, then the product will be negative. The commutative property says that two or more numbers can be multiplied in any order. So 3 times 2 is the same as 2 times 3. And the associative property says that you can group them and multiply them in any order. So you could have negative 3 times 4 first and then multiply that by 2. Or you could have 4 times 2 first and then multiply that by negative 3. You'll get the same answer. Let's look at problem solving. A submarine descended from the surface of the ocean at a rate of 75 feet per minute. What was its depth after 12 minutes? So I'm going to organize my work. I'm going to say beginning. Depth was at the surface of the ocean, so it was 0. And it descended 75 feet per minute for how long? 12 minutes. So my plan is that I will multiply 75 times 12 to find out how long or how deep it goes. And I get 900 and write my units, feet. So 75 times 12. So its depth after 12 minutes was 900 feet below sea level, and I know it was below sea level because it was descending. So to summarize this lesson, when you multiply two numbers with the same sign, the product is positive. Multiply two numbers with different signs, the product is negative. So today you saw how to multiply positive and negative integers, and you saw how to decide whether the product is going to be positive or negative. And that's the end of today's lesson.